Welcome to another episode of the WAN Manager podcast. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, as always, and this is the show where we talk to networking experts about the data services that make business possible. So when I first started benchmarking networks back around 2013, the key use case that we had then, and for really many years after, was just making sure that the end user's carrier was agreeing to lower prices kind of in concert with what the market was doing across their network over the life of that contract, and make sure that you were thinking about that for the next 3 years or 5 years, say, on how prices were going to change. Because there's one sort of true thing in telecom, which is that prices are always headed in the downward direction, and you need to stay on top of that and make sure that you are getting the best out of your carrier. Believe it or not, we still do have some customers who that's what their primary goal still is. They're going for renewal with maybe a large kind of global provider and just want to make sure that their prices reflect what has happened in the market. But for the vast majority of our customers, life is much more complicated these days because they're coming out of this MPLS-based environment, going into the cloud first, to the UCaaS, to SaaS kind of situations, local internet breakouts, adopting SD-WAN, all those kinds of challenges that make this a much more complicated environment, and making the benchmark process about a lot more than just how much have my prices fallen, but more about sort of what is the right mix of products, how's that going to affect my bottom line, and all of those kind of changes to accommodate everything else that's been going on in IT outside of the IT infrastructure team. So it gets really complicated, and I wanted us to be able to have an episode to sort of cut through how do you get from the MPLS network to your network of the future, if you will, and sort of make that transition as smooth as possible, and understand what the budgetary and technological impacts are going to be along the way. So to help me out with that, because I certainly couldn't do it by myself, I'm pleased to welcome to the show Ian Calderbank of Calderbank Consulting. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, and I should have said welcome back, because you've been on the show before. So about a year ago, episode 215, if anybody wants to go back. And you were then in a different professional role than you are now. So I thought maybe, even though you've already been on the show and people could go back and listen to that, maybe give us now a sort of a brief intro of your background and kind of talk about what you're up to these days.
Sure. So when I was on the show before, I was the enterprise network architect for PageGroup, a global recruitment firm, one of the largest based out of the UK, and we were working our way through a full transformation of the WAN from basically an old school MPLS design to a complete transformation to DIA, SD-WAN, SASE, and cloud-based infrastructure, in our case, Microsoft Azure. And actually, I was just thinking, because that was last year. I think the first time we spoke, Greg, was probably around about 2018, when we were first looking at the costs of MPLS to our organization.
Apropos to my intro, right? So it's like, the very first time it's thinking about how much should this cost. Now it's what happens when I blow it all up, right? So, yeah, absolutely.
So that was a major transform of a global organization's WAN and network security infrastructure. I've since moved on from that role, so I'm now working as a freelance network architect, network/network consultant. So I'm doing network consultancy projects for kind of the hard stuff. The organizations that have got interesting looking problems that need got a certain amount of complexity that needs solving.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I wanted to do this episode with you. That when I saw, because we've been in touch for various purposes since 2018, off and on here and there. When I saw that you had left your role at PageGroup, were in this kind of independent sort of consulting role, I had this idea of like, hey, telegeography has all of these data that we collect about network infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, and of course pricing, doing the benchmarks and whatnot. But we're not engineers. We've never done any WAN transformations ourselves, and I kind of saw this opportunity to reach out to you and say, hey, would you want to sort of hitch to our wagon a little bit, utilize our data, and help someone actually go through that entire process that you've been through and did with sort of flying colors there. So to make that clear at the start of the show, kind of what we're going to be talking about here is how the two of us, sort of telegeography on my side / me, and then you on your sort of independent consulting role, could take a customer through this kind of transformation in a sort of full service kind of way, like the data for the decision making coming from us, and the knowledge about how to actually make that work coming from you. If that sounds like a fair assessment of kind of our plans to you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a shameless plug, if you like, for
Yeah, I mean that's what we're here for.
for what we're going to be doing. So
Yeah.
I mean, I see that from the experience I've had, that there's going to be quite a lot of organizations who kind of know that they need to transform, but might not necessarily know how to get started, and they wouldn't necessarily get the best advice from their incumbent service provider. So it's worth looking for some external advice, if it's not necessarily even the whole build the whole shooting match for you, but to get a second opinion, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. And also, to be clear, there's a whole range of sort of like onboard expertise and experience at all the enterprises that I talk to for various purposes over the years. And there may be some who just want to still go to an MSP and kind of hand it all over. I think in this kind of case, where we're probably talking to someone most closely who doesn't need to still farm everything out to an MSP, but once like a really solid idea of how to make this transformation largely themselves, maybe putting together different vendors and that kind of thing, without just going to a full kind of outsource situation again, which is the right decision for some folks, but not all, certainly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. So let's jump into it, and I want to start out thinking about kind of the current state, or what we might call legacy networks, even though that legacy network, so to speak, is the present network for many organizations out there. We run the WAN manager survey. I talk to people about this kind of thing all the time, and we have benchmarking customers coming in these situations that are still in a kind of mostly MPLS network, breaking internet traffic out centrally, trying to run all of these cloud-based tools out of a centralized breakout still, and that kind of thing. Often still having data centers mostly on premises and whatnot. Could you take us through sort of your view of the current state of the network and what its pain points are in this different environment that we find ourselves?
Sure. So I've got a kind of like a top 4 or top 5 of the typical issues that I see. So where you have organizations that have merged, mergers and acquisitions type
Right.
behavior within the companies, joining each other, or where you simply have organic growth that has not been particularly well governed, or not necessarily had much in the way of a strategy behind it, then you often end up with these diverse networks that they kind of got a label of, the label on the outside might say this is all red, but when you go and look under the covers, then there's a red bit and a blue bit and a green bit and a yellow bit, and they don't really talk to each other particularly well. So if somebody's got a customer that they want to attach to the red bit and another customer that they want to attach to the green bit, can those two customers talk to each other? Nah, they can't, because it's not really been integrated. So that's one that I've seen quite a few examples of, both within enterprise and also within the sort of small to medium service provider kind of spectrum, which is where there's sometimes a little bit of an overlap between what's a large enterprise and what's a small service provider.
Yeah, absolutely.
A second obvious point is, still the use of MPLS. in that situation, you may well be feeling like the service provider owns you, if you like. You might
Hmm.
find yourself questioning, whose network is this?
Right.
You may be in meetings with a service provider, and they'll say, "Well, yeah, on our network, we'll do this," and it's like, no, it's not your network; it's my network. But if you actually think about it, they're the ones who are in control and
Hmm.
are basically making all the decisions about how to structure it and how to make changes. You've got very little flexibility.
Right.
Um, you are, of course, tied to them by
Right.
virtue of the fact that you're still on MPLS. So when you're looking for, perhaps different countries or different flexibility in terms of different access media, you're probably quite restricted and not able to do that.
And maybe in some cases not don't even have visibility into it.
Yep.
I've certainly heard lots of folks saying, even if I wanted to get a sort of, map file from my
Yeah.
carrier
Yeah.
that shows me my diverse routes, to each office. I don't even know if they could provide that,
Yeah.
right?
You want to
So
look at what
yeah.
routes you're on. You want to look at what your routing tables are, where's your traffic flowing, net flow, those kind of things. Yeah.
Hmm.
You probably can't get any of that.
Hmm.
Um, Next pain point, typical one, is where you've got on-prem data centers. Often the infrastructure is aging because the business hasn't wanted to invest, because they think, oh, well, we're going to replace this eventually, or we're going to move to cloud. So they
Right.
say, oh, that switch that's 15 years old and went out of support 6 years ago, just kind of keep it running if you can.
Yeah. Yeah.
And every time it
Bubble
falls
gum
in,
and duct tape. That's
yeah,
yeah. That's, yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
yeah, I've seen plenty of examples of that, and as a network manager, you're looking at and thinking, I really have to replace this device, because if it dies, then something big in my data center dies. But then the business says, no, you can't have the money because we want to invest to go cloud. So
Hmm.
that's a real obvious problem. Um, and the other thing you get in this kind of legacy data centers that have been there some time is you'll typically get layers of onions, that what I call the onion layers, that's developed. So you'll have, A will depend on B, and B will depend on C, and C will depend on D, and then it turns out that A is mission critical, and
Right.
D's a single point of failure and out of support, and the last guy who knew about it left the building 2 years ago, and
Right.
you're scratching your head going, how do I make A safe
Right.
without the whole thing collapsing down? And again, it can often depend on, well, actually, the way to do this properly would be to replace some of it or redesign it, but I can't do that because I want to move out of on-prem and into cloud.
Right.
Um, and then the kind of the fourth pain point is the use of centralized breakouts, which kind of goes with an MPLS architecture.
Right.
They'll
Right.
often be delivered as the managed service from your MPLS service provider, typically a managed firewall of some sort. You're likely to hit capacity or performance problems with the typical
Mhm.
modern working systems such as Teams and Zoom. Um,
Right.
it's not architected for that. You'll find yourself running out of bandwidth or getting shocking latency or both.
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean a particular problem I've heard a lot of late, that we're now at a point where a lot of folks are returning to some kind of office schedule. I go in once a week these days, right?
yeah,
And you'll end up having meetings on your laptop in your cubicle,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Over Zoom. Even sometimes when there's a couple other people there in the office with you, but like the rest of
yeah,
the team is remote
yeah.
now, and
You're still
if you're
doing it on.
yeah, and breaking that out, centrally, you're gonna see a pixelated, shadowy figure that
Mm,
sounds like they're on a Star Wars comm unit,
exactly.
right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah,
And then the fifth obvious pain point that I've seen is where a migration to infrastructure as a service cloud has started with your service provider. You may well have got them to put in a private circuit, so an express route uh, type of thing to connect you to a private cloud
right,
from the service provider's cloud. Um, Probably a good idea at the time, because that was the only way you could build that connection with the service provider that you had. But in terms of an evolution to an SD-WAN architecture, you'll find yourself thinking, well, how does this traffic does this SD-WAN traffic supposed to route over the express route, or am I going to try and put it around the outside over the internet? And
hmm
can I get any visibility of what that express route's doing? either from a routing point of view, BGP, or from a NetFlow end. Probably not, because it's on a, generally speaking, it'll be on a shared service provider, provider edge type device in one of their POPs, which is obviously shared across multiple customers. So they're not going to give you, as an end customer, any visibility over control over that. So kind of, the service provider express route, it had its time, but it's something that needs to be moved away from as part of evolving towards an SD-WAN and DIA based architecture.
Yeah, and especially to that point that the vast majority of enterprises that we have in our survey that we talk to aren't just using one cloud service provider. There's not, it's usually not just on Azure. You can't get away with that. It's there's also AWS and Google and Oracle and maybe some IBM thrown in there. And if you have China offices, you have to use Alibaba and all that, right? So it makes that even more complicated. So
actually, I didn't mention the Great Firewall, but if you are an organization that has offices in China, which the one I did the big restructure for is, then that's a whole extra. I define that as a separate problem category in itself.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and then that's not the only sort of geographic area that creates its own other problems. Then there's certain issues with being in South Asia about routing which way the submarine cable goes, and there's issues about being in Middle East, North Africa in terms of the port sizes because of the price and all that, right? So it's like sort of the world is not flat as many people predicted it would be in the internet age. It is far from it. Yeah. So when we were talking about this ahead of time, I really liked the illusion you made that we were going to think through this of the Gordian knot, right? That this is this incredible mess that's complicated, and your task is to sort of, as Alexander the Great did, sort of figure out how to untie the Gordian knot. So in our next stage, right, is looking at this legacy network that's there, and then untying that Gordian knot to get to the network that you really need right now. So if we have a network manager that comes along and finds themselves in this sort of Gordian knot stage, one of the problems that they have isn't just what should my network look like to accommodate all of these changes, but it's how do I get from where I am now to that network without angry phone calls every other day, right?
Yeah,
every other day might be like a severe underestimation, even, right? So
so it can be quite easy to draw the target state. You could draw a nice Visio diagram or PowerPoint that says this is what I believe our network should look like, for the future, to support our business. Most people can have got a reasonable strategy idea out of that for their organization. But you've got the problem you've got is what have you got now, and how do you get to that state? And of course, you can't actually do what Alexander did and take a sword to the thing, because
exactly
you need to
very appealing though, isn't it? It's like,
just trash it and build a new one. But no, we have to keep business continuity. We have to keep the lights on. We have to keep it all running. So there's this thing that one of my old bosses talked to me about many years ago, which is this thing, the tyranny of the immediate. That you'll find yourself doing so much firefighting and so much, well, I've got to reboot that switch, or I've got to put that upgrade in, or I've got to build that new office, or whatever it may be, that you don't actually have the time to think, what do I need to be, where do I need these things to be in 6 months? And if that's going to take me 3 years to get to my target state, then so be it. Let's so you need to look at taking an arm's length approach from that tyranny, and just separating out part of your functionality, part of your thinking power to analyze what is the current situation, what's the plan that you're going to need to execute to get to where you need to be. And that's basically about drawing out a big dependency map of what relies on what, which
Right.
piece can we move first? Think of it, instead of Gordian knot, think like three-dimensional chess that they played in, I think it was in
Yeah.
Star Wars or Star Trek, I can't remember. It's
Yeah.
like, well,
Yeah.
which piece can we move first without the other ones all falling down? And actually,
Right.
we might even need to buy some pieces that we don't actually need long term, but we
Hmm.
might need them as a safe place to keep things running for an interim period, say,
Right.
something like that.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
so
and to be able to justify that to
yeah,
the purse string holders too, right? So
mm,
I think and kind of shameless self plug, but I think very realistic is that this is where it becomes really helpful to have an outside set of eyes, right, and information for that matter, because like you said, if you're in the tyranny of the immediate, and it's very difficult to do that polling back, whereas it's sometimes very easy for someone who's outside of that situation, not having to deal with that day-to-day stuff, to
mm,
look at what you have and say, okay, this is where you can go. And so even if you as a network manager sort of like certainly could do this in the perfect world, it's almost you're being asked too much. They're asking too much of you to be able to do that kind of layer of thinking on top of the keeping everyone happy on a day-to-day basis, if that makes sense.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, then once we're sort of thinking through that sort of uh, interim period, like you said, you might even already have kind of a picture of what the end state looks like. And I know that certainly, one of our sort of mantras when we're talking to, people that are interested in our survey results or our customers who are interested in a benchmark, every network is unique. So whenever I say, you can save X percent, or I always have to say, of course, everyone's network is unique. But maybe you can provide for us the contours, the broad brushes of what that target state network kind of looks like, and what you think the typical sort of enterprise multinational corporation should be looking at getting to, as they finish this journey.
Yeah, of course. I mean, uh, as you said, every network's different, so nothing is going to be perfect for everyone's environment, and
Right.
you've always got local specifics to consider. But in general, there's very few reasons now to stick with MPLS.
Hmm. Hmm.
Possible exceptions, places like China, where it
Right.
probably does still make sense, but almost everywhere else, you can look at DIA and you can use it to do all the same things that you would have previously done with MPLS, because guess what? In most network carriers, the
Hmm.
DIA service is delivered on exactly the same backbone
The
as the
same network.
MPLS. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's the
Yeah.
same wires, it's the
Yeah.
same fibers,
Absolutely.
it's the
And
same
you
undersea
can
cables.
get similar SLAs with
Yeah,
with that. It's you're just and truthfully, there were people who were skeptical of the vendors saying this, but I mean, years ago, the SD-WAN vendors were sort of arguing like, hey, all of those things that made MPLS so useful for you 15 years ago, we can do with this overlay now,
mm,
right? So and I think that has borne out to be more or less true. There are some other things that
mm,
pop up that are ancillary to that, like the middle mile issues and whatnot.
yeah.
But
So
broadly speaking, that looks true, right? So
yeah, so I mean, some of the SD-WAN vendors were sort of, on a sales pitch 2 or 3 years ago around, you can just use, basic broadband for everything, and our error
right,
correction will take care of everything. And maybe that still works for small offices and the like. But
yeah, yeah,
if I was a FTSE 100 or an S&P
hmm
500
right,
organization, I would not be going broadband left, right, and center. I'd be going
exactly. That's
dual
worth
dual
pointing
dual
out.
D, dual carrier, tier 1, tier 2 grade
Hmm.
DIA for
Yeah,
every office. You're going to get exactly the same backbone as if you bought MPLS, and you're
yeah,
going
and
to
there's
get
a
exactly the same
big
performance.
difference in price still between sort of business broadband, which is ultimately business broadband is just consumer
Mm,
broadband with some different language in the T's and C's, right?
mm.
So it is functionally, so I think that's important for people to always have at the focus when we're talking about internet first kind of
Yeah,
networks. we're almost always really talking about DIA, not about something
Absolutely.
like
Broadband has its
consumer
place as
broadband.
backups or
Yeah,
for
yeah,
small sites and those kind of things. But
hmm
for your target position should be DIA
yeah,
unless not possible.
right, right.
Um, what that then allows you to do is you can pick DIA from carrier 1, DIA from carrier 2, and guess
hmm
what? They're both on the internet, so
Right.
they're interconnected. Um, I say interconnected. One of the things you have to look at when you're planning your network architecture is where are the interconnect points and
hmm
how well are they interconnected. Is it at some IXP that's a little bit thin on capacity, or have they got nice
Right.
big fat peerings, and do they peer in the right places?
hmm
Because sometimes you may find that it looks like they've got a peering, but actually they don't exchange any routes there.
Right.
So they might both be members of that AXP, but they actually everything routes back to Miami or something like that.
hmm
Whereas
hmm
I've seen that, for example, in South
Yeah.
America, it looked like they appeared in Sao
Right.
Paulo, but actually they didn't.
Yeah, that's
Um,
very often the case. Doing that trombone back to Napa, the Americas.
yeah,
And I should say, near and dear to our heart at TeleGeography, right? This is
absolutely.
exactly what we think about the geography of networks and why it matters, right? So, yeah.
But one of the benefits of just think you got to go DIA is that you then you can say it's a commodity service. I've set the specifications for what I want. I'm going to buy an instance of it from carrier B and an
Right.
instance of the same from carrier C, and if one of them gives me less than what I wanted, I can go back to carrier A and I'll know I'm buying the
Yeah.
same thing. I'm not tied in.
And I think that's actually, and you can view this in a way as an opportunity for carriers, in the sense that, like, yeah, MPLS was wonderful because you basically had to have a very small number. If it wasn't one, it was still a
Mm,
very small number of MPLS providers, because that's the nature of MPLS. It has to
mm,
be that carrier's network. And so they had a lot of customer stickiness that way, and that sort of thing. But now there's this opportunity for carriers who couldn't sort of capture those very large multinationals on a single MPLS network, to provide really good DIA in key locations and be attractive to an enterprise that wouldn't have been able to use that
absolutely.
carrier because of their regional nature or whatever in the past. So
Yeah.
depending on which end of the carrier universe you're in, this is actually potentially like a big opportunity. And not to
Yep.
say even the large global players, they've seen the writing on the wall.
Mm.
They're trying to buy into this sort of new world as well, and integrate other
Yeah,
services.
I mean, it certainly varies
So
by geography, but the likes
yeah,
of Latin America and
hmm
Africa,
yeah,
when the place I was working before, we were using regional carriers in those countries, or sometimes national carriers, because there
hmm
was a couple of local players who were clearly the best for that area.
right, right,
But they didn't have global coverage, but that didn't matter. So yeah, that was an opportunity for
hmm
those guys to um, get business elsewhere, and an opportunity for an enterprise to source better connectivity rather than having to rely on one of the global big guys.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then just sort of hope for the best in all regions outside of
Mm,
even the most global carrier is still at bottom rooted in a few regions. You know what I mean?
exactly.
No one truly has their own on net kind of service everywhere in the world. And so being able to have that problem, now it does, maybe in some ways pass that problem on to the enterprise, but with that problem comes this ability to pick best in breed, to have control over the situation, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the things to look at are, the technical connectivity. I was talking about IXPs and that kind of stuff. Work out where have they got POPs. Obviously, there's all the discussions about service. TeleGeography's pricing analysis will help you from the commercials point of view.
hmm
Um, and one of the things that's worth looking at is actually how do you structure your RFP? What
hmm
what questions do you ask in order to make absolutely sure that you're getting the correctly specified services, and that's something that I can advise on um, from a technical layer, to make sure that those questions around the connectivity, the IX interchanges,
Yeah.
the undersea cables. If you're going global, then that's kind of stuff that's worth
That,
keeping an eye.
just like at the top, that's exactly why I kind of had this idea that we should work together in this kind of thing. Is that we have all of this information about where all the carriers are located, which submarine cables they're on, which data centers they're in, who has fiber into what data centers, how much does it cost for all of that. But ultimately, we're in the information business. We just throw that at the enterprise and say, okay, like
It's
now,
numbers, figure it out. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's exactly where you sort of come in, is like, okay, let's take that's a lot of powerful data. Let's take it and turn it into something actionable for your network. I think that is going to be really interesting to sort of watch how this plays out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As we've sort of gone through here and seen, what all the parameters are, I think, it's pretty clear we've moved beyond that world where you pick a big incumbent provider for your multinational network every few years and then kind of set it and forget it. And maybe to your point, spend the interim years just putting out fires, right? Now we have all of these, network selections to make. The IT infrastructure group also has to make it work with not just the layer 1, 2, 3 stuff, right? But with the SD-WAN overlays, maybe some middle mile overlay kind of services. And of course, what is on everybody's mind these days is the security piece, right? And everyone wants to get to where they've implemented ZTNA and SASE and stuff like that. Now that has, and we've talked about this a lot on the show, and with a lot of customers, when that has traditionally been outside of the IT infrastructure team to some extent, right? The making security decisions. It's now very much, it has to be, if it's not, it's a problem, integrated into the WAN team. What do you think are the best practices there through thinking through, if I'm going to make these changes, my whole security posture is going to change. It's not just my carrier's problem anymore. How does that fit into the network team's sort of purview?
Yeah. So the way I like to think of it is that in this architecture, SD-WAN and SASE and ZTNA, those acronyms can intermingle sometimes between different vendors.
It's so complicated.
So
Yeah,
consider them
exactly.
all in the round. But those technologies are now all part of your WAN.
Right.
Your WAN boundary no longer stops at the interface of your on-premises router or firewall. It goes all the way into the SD-WAN orchestration and cloud systems. It goes all the way into the SASE providers, data centers and cloud security stacks, and it goes all the way through whatever ZTNA based approach that you're using to bring your end users into your network. So you can't just say, oh, that's a problem for the security
right.
guys. No, it's as WAN manager, you have to know that stuff. You have to think of this is part of my WAN. I have to monitor it. I have to understand how it works. I have to assess performance on it. I have to make sure I understand what the user experience is. And what I have to think about is, it is, at the end of the day, software. So you have to think, if you are the type of organization that likes to do long, contracts and tie-ins, then okay, so be it. But fundamentally, one SASE vendor can, generally speaking, be swapped for another. They, broadly speaking, solve the same problem, obviously with different technology and different secret source. But you can kind of look at the architecture of, say, I'm not going to name names, but a couple of different vendors, and go, yeah, they're kind of broadly the same. There's some kind of user agent. There's some kind of tunnels to a bunch of distributed data centers. They do a bunch of security processing within that data center, and then they spit it out to the internet.
Push it back out, right?
Yeah. So always try and bear in mind what's the performance of the architecture of the one that I'm using, and then keep an eye on the other guys. If only to make sure that your current vendor stays honest from a pricing point of view.
Yeah, that's a great point. Exactly. And I should say, more sort of shameless self promotion here that we intend to integrate that into our benchmarking practice. Sort of as benchmarkers, we for the most of the life of benchmarking networks, it was about your MPLS port, your DIA, and your local access bit, maybe a little bit for the CPE. We then had to add in SD-WAN. We're now adding in, middle mile optimization if you need that kind of thing, or fabric kind of, cloud connections. And then hopefully we'll get there soon with adding in the sort of security bits from the network standpoint. Obviously, it doesn't make sense for us to cover just like general IT security, but we're going to look at, sort of each of those elements, like, you're getting privileged access management or whatever. There's going to be some sort of identifiable cost that should really kind of fall into the WAN in benchmarking out your network in a way that it didn't previously. So we're looking at adding that bit in, because you're right. In the end, that is going to be a key differentiator, right? Is how much does this cost? Because there's a lot. Well, I should say there's a lot of kind of sassy washing going on, like there was with SD-WAN a few years ago, right? So it's not even just the price, but looking at like, what is this service actually? So breaking SASE down, or ZTNA likewise, into discrete things that you get a solution from a vendor, and what it actually does for you, and where it happens too. And I think that's important as well, and especially in this world that we're in now. You're a company that previously had 150 sites, in a certain sense, now has 10,000 where each of their employees are located, right? So when you're talking about the edge, that edge is more decentralized than we could have possibly imagined a couple of years ago, right? So yeah, so Ian, I think this was really interesting. I think as a picture of kind of like what the modern WAN is and whatnot. I think what I'm interested to see is kind of how we can end up putting this in practice, right? So like if you're thinking about making this kind of transition, I think once we get a look at a particular network, it's going to be great to see how we can put all of this together, our sort of deep base of data and your deep base of knowledge about how to successfully do this and help some folks out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I think we'll probably do this a few times again yet, as we get some new thoughts on how to make this work in reality. But any sort of parting thoughts from you on how to make this all work for the best from your old seat as a WAN manager?
Yeah. So it really does help to start this from outside. That was how I did this.
Right.
There was someone else who was keeping the lights on, putting out the fires,
right.
that kind of thing. And it's not for the first time. I've actually done this 3 or 4 times now in my career in various different places. It's a common theme. You've got one person. I won't say one guy. It might be one man or one woman who are the
right.
They are the WAN manager, and they kind of know how it all works, and they kind of have a plan for what they need to do to fix it, but they are just flat out with making sure that service works for the business on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
And I say I've done this, I think 4 times now in different organizations, to come in from the outside and be able to take a look at what's going on and draw the map. Sometimes it's complicated, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you actually just need to draw a map that says, I think you need to do this, and they'll look at it and go, oh yeah, we kind of thought that, but we weren't sure. It might not actually be that hard. Sometimes it is hard. Sometimes you've got to move, like I said, temporary pieces to one side before you can actually put them where you want to put them. So that's my takeaway, is that sometimes you will find yourself thinking, I just don't know how to get this to where I want it to be, because there isn't time spare to think. Bring in an outside view, and you should be able to get there.
Yeah, exactly. I think about this with benchmark stuff all the time. I make this argument. It's kind of about economies of scale. Like, do you need to do a benchmark? I could just run an RFP. Yeah, you could run an RFP, and that will be your day job for the next 6 months, and it will cost a lot of money, or you could let someone else essentially run your RFP for you by having a bunch of data about that we've already collected, and it's all scalable. And so it's like, the cost to us is a lot less than it is, to you. And so I think this is very much the same concept that you don't need to do this all the time, so just like you don't need to run an RFP all the time. And so that's not your sort of job description, right? So it makes sense to have someone who can pull back and let you do your job and help you through, this without you switching your role basically for a period of time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Well, with that, everyone listening knows how to find me. How do they find you?
Check me on LinkedIn. All my credentials and references are on there. And say contact me through there.
Excellent. Yeah. And now I can say you can also contact you through me. So I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much. And for taking time out on a Monday afternoon. We were saying right before the show, we both did some big cycling trips this weekend, and we're kind of a little bit knackered from that, but we made it through.
Aching and bruised. Yeah.
Exactly. Knackered and bruised. Excellent. That's the best way to be. That's why I love cycling. So awesome. Well, thanks, Ian. And we'll talk again soon. Definitely.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening. The WAN Manager podcast comes from the team at TeleGeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. I also wrote the theme song that you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com. Or if you want to get right into more WAN content like you hear on the show, you can visit TeleGeography's WAN forum at wanforum.com. We've got all of our podcast episodes over there, WAN Manager survey data, and extra analysis pieces. That's all for now. So until next time, WAN enthusiasts.